First of all, thank you so much for tuning in. We're going to talk a little bit about the VBMAPP assessment, what it is, how to run it, and a little bit about how to read it. My name is Emily Schwab. I'm a board-certified assistant behavior analyst and a 4-year special education teacher. I've taught kids in a pre-K inclusion program, so all under the age of 7. So I have a fair amount of experience running this assessment, and I hope that I answer all of your questions today. But of course, if I don't, my email address is at the end of this presentation. Please feel free to send feedback, comments, questions. I definitely welcome all of it. So before we get started, just a little FYI, VBMAPP is an acronym that stands for Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment and Placement Program. So what is it? The VBMAPP was written by Mark Sundberg, who is also BCBA, and it comes in 2 parts. There's a protocol and a guidebook. And between the 2 parts, the VBMAPP includes a milestones assessment, a barriers assessment, a transition assessment, a task analysis and skills tracking sheet, and a VBMAPP placement and IEP goals sort of suggestions of where to go next. So it includes those 5 parts. I was lucky enough to see Sundberg present on the assessment a few years ago, and it was a 2-day full 8-hour training. So he's a lot more fluent in this than I am. So to avoid holding you all here for 2 straight days, we're just going to briefly cover the milestones assessment and the barriers assessment. That will kind of get you off the ground and running and hopefully be of enough help to you, at least in the beginning. So who is this assessment written for? It's written for learners whose language skills have not yet surpassed that of a typically developing 4-year-old, regardless of their chronological age. So that could be for a 7-year-old if their language development skills are not yet those of a 4-year-old. And it could also be for a learner who is preschool age. It could be for a typically developing 3-year-old. You might be able to run this assessment. In fact, that's probably really good practice. And it's also for a learner whose language skills are considered at risk. So maybe a child who has no words by the age of 2. This assessment would sort of cover all of those types of learner. So the first part we're going to look at is the milestones assessment. This piece of the assessment really looks into what does the learner know? What skills do they have? This is a great baseline assessment. So maybe you got a new client, or you've just come into a new job, you're meeting new kids for the first time, new students, new learners. This would be a great assessment to go ahead and run and kind of give you a good heads up about what skills the learner already has in their repertoire. So if you open up your protocol book, one of the first pages you'll see is called the master scoring form, or you'll also hear it called the scoring assessment grid, things like that. You'll notice that it's divided into 3 different levels. So we've got level 1 down at the bottom in red, level 2 in green, and level 3 in blue. Up at the top, it gives you some space to add in the child's name, the date of birth, and then the dates that they were at testing is over on the right. So the dates that you test them, it coordinates a color with that, and you're able to put the tester's initials there, and that just kind of helps to kind of keep track of how often you run this assessment. The assessment is designed to be run 4 different times for the same learner, and so that's why there's a different color, and we'll go into that a little bit more. So if we break down each of those 3 levels, you'll see that level 1, which is that red level on the bottom, indicates milestones that learners 0 to 18 months should be hitting. Level 2, which is the green level, the second level, learners 18 to 30 months should be hitting these milestones. And finally, level 3, that blue level, learners from 30 to 48 months should be hitting these milestones. The VBMAPP is a criterion reference assessment, meaning that an individual's results are compared to a preset standard. And so that's kind of how all of this is devised. If we look a little bit deeper into level 1, you'll notice that it's divided into 9 different repertoires. Again, this level is, the milestones are aligned with learners who are 0 to 18 months of age. So those 9 repertoires are along the top there, you can see, and we'll go into each of those in a little bit of detail. The first is demand, so that's just your request. Does the child ask for things? How many things do they ask for? How often do they ask for them? The second repertoire is the tact. So the label, does the child know the names of things? Can he or she label things? The third is the listener. Can the child follow directions? Can he or she select items or pictures when asked to do so? The third is abbreviated as VPMTS. It stands for visual, perceptual, or match to sample skills. So these skills look at, can the child attend to books and toys? Can he or she match items? How are their skills as a visual learner? Play is next. Can the child demonstrate early play skills by exploring objects and their own motor behavior? Are they curious with toys? Are they running? Are they jumping? Are they playing? The next one is social. Does the child notice other people? Do they attend to other people? Do they typically watch them? Do they attempt to interact with them? Kind of where does the child fall on that social aspect? Imitation is next. So is the child able to copy the behavior of others? Echoic deals with, can the child repeat specific words or phrases when they're said by an adult or a peer? And lastly, vocal looks at, does the child experiment with his or her voice? Do they make noises? Are the noises different or are they repetitive? Do they babble? Have they kind of begun to recognize that their voice can get them what they want? So we'll look a little bit further into each of that. We're going to go kind of a little bit deeper into the manned repertoire for today. And I'm not going to go into each one because, again, that would take us a long, long time. But we'll delve into the manned a little bit deeper so I can kind of give you a good background about what each of these looks like. So that manned repertoire, as you saw on that last slide, and I'll flip back real quick, is divided into 5 sections, actually 10 mini sections. So each section has 2 parts. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And each of those deal with 5 of the milestones related to that manned in level 1. So we look a little bit closer. You continue to flip through your protocol book and you get to level 1 manned milestones. So it's, again, separated into 5. The main thing that this repertoire is looking at is, does the child use words, signs, or pictures to ask for desired items or activities? The very first part of this, kind of what Sundberg sees as the first milestone in getting toward this goal, is that the child emits 2 words, signs, or pecks, but they may require echoic, imitative, or other prompts, but no physical prompts. So maybe mom has to hold up the cracker and say, do you want the k? And the child will say cracker. Or maybe the dad has to hold up a book and present the American Sign Language sign for book, and the child will imitate that sign to ask for the book. So things like that. And it goes on from there. So it increases in number, emits 4 different mands, generalizes 6 mands, spontaneously emits 5 mands, emits 10 different mands, goes up in number, and then also goes up in complexity. So are they asking for things without any prompts? Are they generalizing their mands? Can they ask for 2 different books? Can they ask both mom and dad? And can they ask, in Target and also in their bedroom at night? And then are they doing that spontaneously in number 4? So are they just coming up to mom or dad and saying that they want the crackers, or does that situation have to be contrived? And then finally, number 5 looks at whether they're able to ask for 10 different items. So again, increasing the number with no prompt except for maybe, what do you want? When we look at scoring the Milestones Assessment, there are 4 sections for each milestone, as we talked about. There's enough space to run the assessment 4 separate times for the same learner. So again, you usually do the assessment 1 year apart, but you might do it when you come into a new business, when you meet new students, new learners, new clients. You might do it if you're needing to write new goals. It might be a good time to run the assessment. That IEP is coming up, or you're creating a new treatment plan. Things like that are all good times to rerun the assessment so you can see progress and kind of get an idea of where your learner is. The scores for each of these milestones are either a 0, a half a point, or a 1, and they're added together and recorded in the total score box. Each milestone can be scored as followed. 1 point indicates that the child can complete the skill as it is written. There are no exceptions. They can absolutely do it every single time. As half a point can be scored for a child who is able to complete some portion of the skill, but they're not yet mastered the entire skill. And this is where your guidebook really comes in handy. While a half point is sometimes allocated for being able to do half of the required number, that's not always the case. So you'll really need to go back and reference your guidebook to see when you're allowed to give a half of a point. And then, of course, you can give a 0 points. So that kind of says, I've assessed the skill. The learner is not able to do it independently at the level that's described or at the requirement for a half of a point, and so this skill gets a 0. So for an example, one of our milestones within the man repertoire is that the student will spontaneously man 5 times during a 1-hour observation. They get a point if they manned 5 times during a 1-hour observation. They get a half a point if they manned 2 times during a 1-hour observation. And that would be 0 points if they manned 1 time or fewer, or if they manned 2 times, but they require physical prompts. So again, I had to reference the guidebook because half of 5 obviously is 2.5, and the requirement is just 2. And so sometimes it's not always right at the half mark. So to go back a little bit to within our protocol to the assessment piece, when we have this scoring guidelines in our mind and we're looking back at this, within that first box, these are where we're going to run that first assessment. The very first one gets the score of a 0, a half a point, or a 1. The compilation of all 5 of these, that all gets put up into this total score box right here for that first running of the assessment. And then you can record the score for each of the 4 assessments here. Another important note is that at the end of each milestone will be an assessment code, and so that kind of tells you how you need to assess for that particular skill, and we'll talk about that next. And another very important spot here is the spot here for comments or questions, notes, things like that. I particularly like to write in what my learner might have asked for or which pictures they could identify, so that when I'm running this again in a year, I can say, oh, they were already able to ask for cracker and book last year, so those won't count as additional mans. They can still obviously continue to count as their 2 mans. So thinking about those assessment codes, the codes are as follows, and this is explained very well in the protocol book. A T means that you need to directly test the skill. So you must obtain these data by directly testing this milestone. An O means that you can observe the skill occurring. So you must obtain these data by observing but not interfering with the learner. So maybe if we're looking at, for instance, labeling and you're looking at, does the learner spontaneously label 3 things in the environment? And you have to do that by observing. So you can't go in and say, what is this? You just have to say whether they're saying, oh, an airplane, or, there's a car, that's mama's car, things like that. Those would be tasks that they're kind of emitting without you needing to interfere with that. So that would be data that you would obtain through observation. The E either means that you can test it or you can observe it. Personally, I like to do a little observation and see if I can see it spontaneously without interfering, but if need be, you can jump in and directly test that milestone. And then TO stands for timed observation. So you must obtain these data by completing a timed observation of your learner. And generally that will correlate with some sort of a goal. So spontaneously mans for 10 different items, and that must be tested or assessed via timed observation for 60 minutes. So within 60 minutes, the learner has to ask for 10 items. If they don't, they do not meet that aim. So that has to be completed within a certain amount of time. So for example, to look back again at our manned repertoire, I assessed this with my learner. They were able to emit 2 signs, words, or pecks. They may require imitative, echoic, or other prompts, but no physical prompts. So I gave them a full point. They were able to do that skill. And then they were able to man for 2 additional items. So now they've hit the 4. So I gave them a point for that. I then saw them man for 2 additional items, and they were able to generalize all 6 of those items across 2 people, 2 different settings, 2 different examples of that item. So I was able to give them a point for that. Then I did a timed observation. I observed my student for 60 minutes, and I noted that they were able to spontaneously ask for 5 different things. Some of them items present, not all of them, but they hit that 5 mark in a timed observation. So I didn't come in and ask them what they wanted. They just spontaneously asked for 5 different things. So I gave them a point. Number 5, however, they were not able to get above 6. So while they were able to generalize 6 different mans, they could not hit the 10 mark. And so I gave them 0 points for that. They didn't reach the half point mark. They required some different prompts, things like that. They got a 0 for that. So I went ahead and noted that 1, 2, 3, 4, and 0 is a total of 4, which I'm noting in my assessment box up here. I also made sure to make a note about number 4 in particular, that in July of 2016, Susie is able to request for her cat Binky a toy car, crackers, a juice box, and her pink tutu spontaneously. So those were the things that she requested without having to be shown the item or asked what she wanted. I then take those notes that I made, so my scoring in that first column, and I transfer that onto the assessment grid. So where I indicated a 1 that the student was able to complete the skill, I then find number 1 and I color that entire box. The dotted line indicates that half point mark, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but for right now the student got a 1 colored in the entire box. In milestone number 2, they also scored a 1, colored the entire box. 3 and 4 followed suit with scores of a 1, so the entire box is colored. They got a 0 for benchmark number 5 or milestone number 5, and so I did not color in any piece of that box. And that's how that first manned column for that repertoire will look in level 1 on my scoring grid. Some other common possibilities for scoring is that the student scored got a 1 on milestone number 5, so I colored it all the way in. Milestone number 4, however, they only were able to do half of that milestone. They were only able to complete that, and so I gave them a half, and that's what your half point will look like. Same for number 3, they were only able to do half, so I colored them below the dotted line. Number 2, they were able to complete the full milestone, the full skill, and same with number 1. Another potential option for scoring is that I assessed every milestone within the manned repertoire for level 1, and my learner was just not at that level. So if we think back to the first milestone is that they were able to omit 2 mands, maybe requiring some prompts, but their PECs or their vocal or their sign. Maybe this learner isn't really asking for anything, or the only way that they're able to ask is by looking at something. I know that they want something because they just sort of look at it, but they're not using their words to ask, they're not signing to ask, and they're not exchanging a picture to ask. And so I'm going to color in that first little dot down at the bottom, indicating that I assessed this repertoire and the learner was not able to score a 1 or a half a point on any of the 5 benchmarks or milestones. Another one of the repertoires within level 1, and it continues in through level 2 and level 3, is the echoic subtest. And this is a specific test that you're going to need to flip through your protocol to find. But the way that the scoring grid works and the way that the milestones work for the echoic repertoire is that it goes through and says the student scored a 15 on the echoic subtest, the student scored a 20 on the echoic subtest, a 25, etc. And so you'll need to run the echoic subtest and get your score in order to be able to score that within the repertoire along sort of those milestones. So for this particular piece of the assessment, you're going to begin at group number 1, which is up here. And you continue running group 2, group 3, group 4, and group 5. Unlike some other assessments, if students are unable to do a few in a row, you don't stop. So I like to try and complete the entire assessment, certainly not in one sitting, but I do like to finish it because a lot of times what happens is while a learner may miss some words in that group 1, they might be already familiar with some words or some phrases in group 3, and so they're able to do those. And I want to be able to give them credit for that. So the way that this works is it lists out words. This first one is ah. So the teacher would say ah, and the student would echo it. If they're able to echo it entirely, so meaning that you could understand each piece of it, we'll get into scoring in a little bit later, you're going to score it accordingly. You score again the entire assessment, don't stop, students can surprise us, and then you will total your score in each group and record here, and the total of each group in the entire assessment will be recorded at the top. It's also important to note that while a lot of our students are very successful using different type of voice output devices, this assessment does need to be vocal in order to receive a score. So we're looking at scoring this. We're going to mark an X, and that means that the correct sounds and the correct number of syllables were emitted by the student. And so the student echoed the word or the phrase exactly how I echoed it. That sort of equals 1 point, but we're going to mark it as an X, and I'll tell you why next. So if the student is able to produce a recognizable response, but it's maybe incorrect or it's missing consonants or it has an extra syllable, you're going to score that as a slash, and that's equal to half point. Differentiating that slash and the X is helpful because the following year, there's only obviously one form for this assessment. So the following year, you go into reassess, and you're going to just go back through all your slashes. If the student is able to echo the word or the phrase completely, go ahead and add another slash and make that an X. And if not, you can leave it kind of as is. So it's important for this piece of the assessment to kind of stick with that slash and X. It just makes it easier down the road. You add up the total number of X's and slashes, and you record in the subtotal for the group box. And then you record the totals in the subtotal groups in the appropriate box at the top of the page. So when I ran this assessment, the student was able to receive full points on the first 3 of these echoics. I believe those words are ah, wow, and b. They had a little bit more trouble with ni and a little trouble with oo, and so I was able to give them a slash mark for those. I added up the totals there and came up with 19 and recorded that in the subtotal for group 1. And that sort of rounds out your part 1, that sort of level 1 in the Milestones Assessment. And while we won't go through the level 2 and level 3 in as much detail, I do want to cover that level 2 and level 3 add additional repertoires. So in level 2, you'll see 4 additional repertoires, including LRFFC, which stands for Listener Responding by Function, Feature, and Class. So that looks at, can a student select an item based on what it does, the function, the one that drives, the one that flies, something about it, a feature, so the one that has wheels, the one that has wings, or its category, the vehicle, the animal, things like that. And the next repertoire that is added in level 2 is IV, which stands for intraverbal. Does the student verbally respond to the content of words of others? Do they engage in conversation? Do they answer questions? The third edition is a group assessment, and these milestones look at, does the child follow daily classroom and group routines and expectations? Are they able to do the things that are expected of them in a classroom or in a group setting? The fourth that's added is a category for linguistics. Is the child's articulation clear? Is his or her vocabulary growing? Are words becoming phrases and sentences? Is all of that sort of happening appropriately? Then when we get into level 3, an additional 3 repertoires are added to look at reading. Does the child show interest in words and books? Can they label letters, read and comprehend words? Writing, which looks at, does the child draw, copy letters and numbers, independently write his or her name? And then math. So does the child know numbers and quantities? Can they count and can they measure? Again, keep in mind that this assessment is only for learners up to 4 years of age. So, what can a 48-month-old be expected to do? So keep that in mind when we're thinking about reading and writing and math and things like that. So some helpful tips for running the milestones portion of this assessment is that you want to keep that guidebook close to you at all times. You reference it frequently until you become fluent with the material and the scoring system. And even after 4 or 5 years of running this assessment, I still need to reference it for half-point scores because I'm still not entirely positive. You want to make sure that you gather your materials and that you read through the test and your test items prior to running the assessment. So your materials include both physical items as well as maybe lists of tasks you may need. So when you get up to some of the higher levels, some of the more in-depth milestones, it's nearly impossible to come up with something like 30 verbal directions right on the spot. So you want to go ahead and have your list so that you can go ahead and reference it and you're not trying to come up with these things as you're trying to assess the student, keep their attention, score the assessment. That can definitely get overwhelming. I would recommend only running a few milestones or repertoires at a time. You will get exhausted and so will your learner, and that's going to definitely impact their performance. So I like to kind of jump in at times of day when they would be used to working on these things anyways and kind of assess in those moments. And the assessment does take, in the beginning, it definitely takes over several days. And as you get better about it, as you learn a little bit more about it and become more fluent, certainly it is a little bit shorter, but you still definitely need to keep in mind what your learner can handle. You want to use a pencil your first few times scoring the assessment. This just makes correcting mistakes a little bit easier. Perhaps you gave a half point, and then you go back and look at the guidebook and you realize that a half point isn't available for that particular milestone, so you can easily sort of erase and add your 0. I definitely recommend making notes in the notes and comments section. It gives you a little bit more comprehensive present level of performance. So, if a student is able to do something, for example, to label pictures, to tagged pictures, it's so helpful to know which pictures they were able to label because maybe patterns start emerging. They're really great with labeling animals, but I noticed that, I gave them credit for all 25 of their labels and they were all animals. That was all they could label. So maybe kind of things start to come out at you that maybe certain repertoires do need a little bit more work, and you see that in your notes. I also always say never underestimate your learner. Test it out. If you test out all of level 1 milestones, so the learner texts 10 items and he's not able to complete that task independently, then it's okay not to test level 3 of the same repertoire. So if they can't tack 10 items, they're probably not going to be able to tack 30 items. That's pretty fair. But other things I would definitely say test it out. Learners have surprised me so much, especially within the intraverbal repertoire and some of the higher level 3 repertoires, the math, the writing, things like that. They'll really surprise you. So I would definitely say to test it out. So the finished product, I've run all of the different milestones. I've looked at everything. And I filled in my grid with the correlating scores, and this is sort of maybe what my finished product might look like. So notice at the top, I have the student's name in, I have their date of birth. I then input the current date, so July 2016, and my initials. I've colored everything yellow as that was the corresponding color. And then it's calculated a score for me. And that's sort of what your assessment will look like. And we'll get in a little bit later into looking at interpreting this assessment. But this might be what your scoring form looks like. This is fairly typical for early learners with an autism spectrum disorder. This sort of curve in the grid here is pretty typical. Okay, so the second part that we're going to talk about is the barriers assessment. And while the Milestones Assessment looked at what your learner is able to do, the barriers assessment helps you assess 24 common learning and language acquisition barriers that are faced by children with autism or other developmental disabilities. And it also, by identifying these barriers, the clinician can develop specific intervention strategies to help overcome these problems, which can lead to more effective learning. And so those were sort of quotes by Mark Sundberg that he felt like really summed up what this barriers assessment is really for. So when we're looking at scoring the barriers assessment, each one presents a different issue that might be faced or a barrier that might be faced by the learner. So as you can see, this first one is negative behaviors. Scoring occurs on a 0 to 4 scale, 0 indicating that this is not an issue for the student, and 4 indicating that this presents a severe barrier to the student's learning. So you'll read each sentence under your barrier 0 through 4. Well, that scoring system is fairly typical. Sometimes the barrier will get in a little bit deeper. So maybe it will kind of explain a little bit more what a 1 would indicate for this particular barrier. So it's important to read all the way through and to find the sentence that best describes your student's negative behaviors or barriers. So, some examples of some of these sentences are things like emits non-compliant behavior several times a day with longer tantrums and more severe behavior. So maybe I'm reading this and I say, well, that's not really this learner. Let's bump down and try number 2. So number 2 is emits non-compliant behavior a few times a day with minor tantrums or other minor behavior. And again, I think, I don't know, it's not really a few times a day. Let me check out number 1. And number 1 is some demands will evoke minor non-compliant behavior, but the recovery is quick. And I think, yep, that's definitely my learner. While he'll do a lot of the tasks presented to him, he really hates math. And so sometimes he'll engage in some non-compliance during math tasks, but he tends to recover pretty quickly, especially if you can distract him. That makes sense. That sounds like my learner. So you're going to add that corresponding number into the first box of the assessment. So for that, I decided a 1 for instructional control, most described my learner and the barrier that this presents to my learner's learning. So I'm going to indicate that 1 score over here in my assessment box. Some tips for the barriers assessment. You want to read each description before scoring. Again, while it's sort of a 0 to 4 score, it's important to read each one because each one goes a little bit deeper into what that barrier means. It's also a great time to learn a little bit more. For example, instructional control is a barrier, and maybe you weren't quite sure what instructional control meant, but if you read through each of those sentences, it kind of plays out for you what instructional control or lack thereof might look like in different situations. So it's definitely important to read each description of each number. And I also definitely want to shoot out the reminder to consider the assessment for each barrier and use your data. So it's very easy to say, in terms of maybe stereotypical behavior, for example, which is one of the barriers. Well, a year ago, she was only flapping in the corner, and now she's definitely working a lot. She kind of only flaps under the table, so that's fantastic. And while that is fantastic for that learner in particular, we would still consider a child who is flapping under the table fairly frequently, we would still consider stereotypical behavior to be a barrier to her learning. And so kind of try to remember what this would look like for a child of the same chronological age when you think about whether this is a barrier for your learner. So the finished product of the barriers assessment might look something like this. This would indicate that, this particular learner sees significant barriers in the defective tact. So that was I scored that a 4. There's some defective intraverbal. That's a 4. There's some defective listener skills, some defective visual skills. So all of those things are kind of up there. Meanwhile, if we look up here at the echoic, the learner doesn't seem to experience a significant barrier to learning in the echoic. So that might indicate to me that, wow, they've got some pretty solid echoic and some pretty solid imitation skills. Maybe I can use both of those things to help out sort of where I see more barriers. So the defective tact, defective intraverbal, things like that. So some tips for interpreting the results. And this is specifically the results of the milestones. You want to find the hole. So teach to the deficits so that splinter skills do not develop. If there's a particular hole somewhere and there's another repertoire that's all the way up in level 2, we want to focus on that hole in level 1 so that we can fill that hole first. Sundberg recommends not continuing beyond the child's chronological age in any repertoire. So if you've got a 1-year-old who's kind of sitting within that level 1, maybe he's 13 months old, he's in level 1, we don't want to be teaching level 3 or even level 2 skills to that child. And we want to teach to deficits and not sort of continue to add on to strengths, because that really just increases gaps in learning. Do not advance one repertoire at the expense of others. So perhaps your learner scored fairly low in the manned repertoire, but their play skills were phenomenal. They scored all the way up into level 2 in play skills. You don't want to keep teaching to level 2 and level 3 in play skills while that manned continues to be underdeveloped. So you want to really put time and resources and energy into developing that manned and kind of ultimately bringing that learner's skill set all to sort of an equal playing field. And we also want to think about ways, and I mentioned this a second ago, looking at those barriers. Is one repertoire strong enough to use that repertoire to teach another repertoire? And we'll look a little bit in that specifically. So again, back to our master scoring form, our scoring grid. This is sort of the way that our learner's assessment played out. And so a quick visual analysis of this would tell us a few things. First of all, I highlighted the holes here with the giant red circles. That's where we need to teach. So again, we don't need to come up into level 2 of the visual perceptual skills, the play skills, social skills, imitation skills. We don't want to teach into level 2 of those until we really can make some progress down here and getting that man, the tact, the listener, the echoic, and the vocal skills up into that same area. Quick visual analysis tells us that the weakest repertoires for this learner are the man, the tact, the listener, the echoic, and the vocal. So what I'm also seeing when I go back to those milestones and see which milestones were missed is that there's not a lot of spontaneous sounds going on. We'll need to probably condition sounds to have value because the learner just isn't using their voice a lot. This, as we said earlier, this sort of splay across this visual grid is fairly typical for a learner with ASD. So a lot of times play skills will be up there, but manding's going to be pretty low. A lot of this vocal behavior is going to be pretty low. The strongest repertoires for the student are visual perceptual, play, social, and imitation. And right off the bat, I'd say that's awesome that play and social are pretty good. That's a really good sign for this learner and for you being able to gain instructional control and to offer social praise, hopefully as a reinforcer later. The imitation skills are stronger than the echoic skills. So when we're thinking about coming up with a communication system for this learner, they're able to imitate really well. Maybe we have a future American Sign Language communicator on our hands. It might be a little bit more difficult to evoke some echoic behavior, but that imitation behavior is already really strong. So maybe we can jump right in and increase these mans by teaching some signs via sort of that imitation pathway. Imitation is also stronger than listener skills. So maybe we could use some model prompts because the learner is able to imitate. They're able to follow a model prompt to teach some listener skills. So we kind of quick visual analysis tells us a few important things about this learner and about kind of where we're going to head next. When we look a little bit closer, we're going to look specifically at the man, the tact, and the listener behavior. In man, the learner scored a 0.5 in milestone 3. And so the piece that they missed is that they were not able to generalize 6 mans across 2 people, 2 settings, and 2 examples of a reinforcer. So maybe, they scored half points. Maybe they were only able to generalize 3 different mans. Number 4, they missed the entire chunk of number 4, the entire point. And that deals with spontaneously emitting 5 mans. The desired item can be present in a 60-minute timed observation. So yikes, I'm not seeing really any spontaneous manding behavior. And then number 5 is that they emit 10 different mands without prompts. The desired item can be present. So again, we're probably looking at volume. Maybe the learner was able to imitate the 2 and the 4, they were able to mand for 2 and 4 items, but they're not able to spontaneously do those things. They're not able to request the volume that number 5 requires. The tact, it looks like they struggle to spontaneously tact 2 different items, and they struggle to then spontaneously tact 10 items. So again, just we need to look at increasing the number of items or pictures that they're able to label. And then the listener, 4.5 requires them to perform 4 different motor actions on command. They scored a 0.5 point, so it's likely that they were able to perform 2 motor actions on command. We just need to be able to increase that. And then number 5, they were not able to select the correct item from an array of 4 for 20 different objects or pictures. So when asked to touch dog, touch cat, they were not able to hit the aim of 20 for that. They also didn't receive half credit, which means that they were not able to hit whatever the guidebook indicates to us is the half point, which I would guess is probably 10 different objects or pictures. A note real quick to look for themes throughout. So the student appears to have challenges with spontaneous speech, both in the mand and the tact. So they missed the number 4 for the tact because they were not spontaneously tacting different items. And they also missed number 4 for the mand because they weren't spontaneously manding. So again, this is kind of indicating that spontaneous vocal speech might be an issue here. And that kind of wraps it up for us. So we kind of talked through the Milestones Assessment. We talked through the scoring grid and how to interpret sort of some of those scores, how to move them to the scoring grid from the Milestones Assessment, and how to look at it, the big picture. We also talked about the barriers and how to sort of delve into each of those and look at what makes the most sense for your learner in terms of scoring the barriers assessment. And then a real quick sort of thought to what to teach next. Again, this training could go on forever, but we're going to go ahead and cut it there, and hopefully that gives you guys enough of a taste that you'd be interested in purchasing the book, purchasing the guidebook. That's definitely what I would recommend doing next, and kind of playing around with it yourself, running it on friends or family members, or thinking about it in terms of TV shows or YouTube videos of learners, and seeing if you can kind of pick out the skills that they're exhibiting, or maybe where they're experiencing some barriers to their learning, things like that. I think that's how you get the most fluent with it. So finally, please shoot me an email if you have any additional questions, any feedback you'd like to give for this presentation, any comments you have. I will gladly hear any of it, and I look forward to hearing from you all. Thanks so much.